So welcome to our final afternoon of this year's summit. And there's two, well, one's more exciting than the other because the last one's me. So first we're going to have our panel about centering Indigenous perspectives. And the question we've been asking all day, how can a federal strategy help? So as our panelists come up, I'm going to introduce our moderator for the panel, Sarah Sark. Sarah Sark is a Mi'kmaq woman from Lennox Island First Nation located in Prince Edward Island, now living in Ottawa. Ms. Sark is the CEO of ConnectWell Community Health, a non-for-profit providing a range of client-centered health, developmental, and autism services in the rural areas of Lanark, Leeds, Greenview, and Renfrew counties. So that's around the Ottawa region. That's a lot of syllables, and I'm trying my best. Sarah is a registered speech-language pathologist, and she was introduced to the world of autism 30 years ago when she attended a Geneva Center event as part of her student placement. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everybody for having me here. I don't know if you know, but I'm a sub for today, so give me some grace here. I'm just going to wing this as I normally do in my life. That's my life. So I'll start by just sort of giving you a bit of a background. As Jonathan said, 30 years ago, I was introduced to the world of autism. Basically, I wanted a placement in a school board, and they said, nope, they weren't taking students. They had a bad student. So they're like, nope, not going to take a student. Well, I was very tenacious, always. And I'm like, I will convince them that they're going to take a student. So I drove myself out to the school board in Halifax, Bedford County, found the speech pathologist, had a meeting with them, convinced them that I'm the best thing since sliced bread. They agreed. And then they called me the next day and said, what are you doing for the next 3 days? And I said, whatever you want me to do. And they took me to this Geneva Center conference and paid for my way to go. And then I came back and they said, okay, now you're going to be in charge of the children with autism in our school board as your placement. I'm like, okay, let's go. Anyway, it was a really great experience. And then I've been working in the field ever since. I started at the front line, working in families' homes and directly with families across all ages, birth to death. And I slowly moved up into manager, director roles, and now as CEO. My impact obviously is a little different now, greater impact, less connection, but I still maintain a very close connection to families. I was telling a story earlier about, I was thinking about the lifespan issue that was talked about this morning. And I'm very fortunate our organization, we see from birth to death. So I have the experience of 18-month-olds that I saw with autism when they were little, before they were diagnosed. And I now know them as adults, and they're still part of our organization. So that's a really special thing to have. So that's me in a nutshell. So let's get to these fine people who've been waiting patiently. So this session is a really important session. We talked a bit about it this morning, but centering Indigenous perspectives and how can a federal strategy help? Being an Indigenous person myself and coming from a small community, we do have unique challenges, unique visions on the world, and our interactions with the world are also very different. So we're going to go through some questions here, and our panelists are going to help us understand how we can better work together with a federal strategy. And so I'm going to throw it to each person to introduce themselves. So first here, I have Jennifer Quayle. Do you want to tell us where you're from, Jennifer?
Yes, my name is Jennifer Quayle, and I'm the Senior Director at the Native Women's Association of Canada. I will say first, I come from a family of settlers who landed on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe. I'm very happy to be here today to take part in this work. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Native Women's Association, it's a national organization founded in 1974. And it advocates for the rights of Indigenous women, girls, two-spirit, transgender, and gender diverse people. And for the sake of brevity in my discussion, I will use the term Indigenous women. We recently completed a project on Indigenous women's experiences with autism. And this was to inform or help inform the National Autism Strategy. So the project was funded by ESDC and Public Health Agency. So that's what I will be discussing today.
Thank you. And beside you, I believe we have Kenny Robertson. Sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, my English name is Kenny Robertson. My spirit name is Squalex, meaning the bear cubs, as I come from the bear clan. And I do have a twin brother. And yes, I am the evil one. So I just want to say good afternoon. Thank you for being here today because this is an important issue. I come from the Shoamic territory, which is located in the Rockies. I have a grandmother that gave me that name as we were twins. I became involved with Four Directions Autism, which I set up to a parent-parent support group in regards to system navigation within the Kanata, as we call it. And the reason being was that I found out I have a child with autism, and I decided to start this for her in her name because she's nonverbal, and I needed to be that voice for her. So I'd like to thank you again for being here, and I appreciate CASA and the supporters and sponsors who promoted this. And thanks again.
Awesome. Thank you. And I think we have Charles next.
Okay. Good afternoon, Charles Brown. I'm originally from Sullicout area. I speak Oji Cree. I'm an educator. I have a teaching background. I taught in the classroom for a number of years, and also I'm a professional translator in my language. And I was born and raised up in a northern remote community. It's called Bearskin Lake, Ontario. It's a remote community north of Sullicout. And I didn't learn how to speak English until I was about 7 or 8 years old, because we were out in our traditional territory, what they called them trap lines back in those days. My family, my parents, my late parents, and my siblings were practically raised in our home traditional territory, in our homelands. But when I look around this room for the past 2 days, I've been observing all the presenters that are sharing their knowledge on autism. This is something that we're facing from where I come from. We're dealing with autistic individuals, and I know we have some in our family. In my own family, we're dealing with our children that are autistic. And also, I know there are some adults that are being diagnosed with that condition. So it could be genetic to some extent, but we're doing our best to deal with those situations. And since being the director of education for my tribal council, we're looking into inviting other partners, other professionals to come and work with us. I think part of the reason that's why Nan asked me to be on this panel today. You know, with my experience dealing with schools and dealing with children and working with our teachers and principals, I think this is why I am here today to talk about those challenges that we're facing today. So I want to thank everybody here for your participation, and I want to thank Nan. And there's a representative here from NAN that invited me to be part of this panel today. Miigwech.
Thank you. And on the end there, we have Bertha.
Good afternoon. My name is Bertha Sutherland. I'm on the Anishinaabe Alaskan Nation Women's Council, and one of my portfolios is sitting on the Child Development Strategy, formerly known as Special Needs Strategy. And I was interested in sitting at that table because I am also a single parent of being an adult on the spectrum. Very proud of his accomplishments so far. He's in the second year of a 3-year college program, his second college program. So I was lucky enough to get him sponsored for tuition to go again. And he's doing quite well, actually. So I'm one proud mama here. yeah, and basically, yeah, looking forward to, and actually in the past 2 days too, sitting here and just listening to the different people I've been fortunate enough to meet and sharing, they've been sharing with me about, what's happening in their communities, and they're giving me ideas on, on what to move forward in the north. You got you.
Thank you. And do we have online? We have Grant Bruno, who's at the University of Alberta. He's a parent and a PhD student. Oh, there you are.
Yeah, Tanse Grant Bruno, Nasigasan, Musquecheese, Ochinia. Hello, everybody. My name is Grant Bruno. I'm from the community of Musquecheese, which is a large First Nation in central Alberta, approximately 18,000 on reserve members. And it's located here on Treaty 6 territory, where I'm currently coming at you live from my house. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to make it, but I'm here. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to share some of my experience and my perspective. I'm a parent to 4 children, 2 of which are autistic. And I'm also a PhD student in medical sciences in the Department of Pediatrics at the University of Alberta, researching autism in my home community of Musquecheese, really looking at cultural perspectives, family perspectives, and just trying to gain my own understanding of what's going on in my community so that hopefully I can share these learnings with other communities, like from where the other panelists are from. So again, thank you all for allowing me to share space with you. Hi.
Great. Thank you so much. It looks like we're going to have a great conversation, some really great minds here. So I'm going to get us started with question 1. What are the current needs and gaps requiring immediate attention for improving autism and neurodiversity supports in Indigenous communities? And I believe, Jennifer, you're on call first.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, so we heard a lot about needs and gaps in our project. What we did was we organized a series of 4 sharing circles with Indigenous women. They were primarily parents of children who were neurodiverse, young children and young adults. And there were a few grandmothers as well who participated, who looked after their grandchildren. So we had great sessions, a lot of great discussions. So I think for today, I've kind of slotted them into 3 themes. The main themes we heard throughout all of the sessions. And so the first, of course, is not going to be new to any of you, I'm sure, but the lack of access to a professional diagnosis, a professional assessment of autism, very long waiting lists to get an assessment, and many waited between 1 to 5 years. And of course, then the high cost of assessment made it very difficult for families to stay afloat financially. And they also noted that there were gendered differences in terms of obtaining an assessment. One woman noted that a misdiagnosis was more common for girls than boys, and that she found the checklist for autism, for the diagnosis, was very male biased. The second recurring theme was that once a diagnosis is made, there's just the huge barriers to overcome in order to find supports. Many of them literally felt abandoned by the system and felt they didn't have the wherewithal to know where to start through a complex maze of guidance on supports available, services available. So it was quite traumatic for them. And particularly for those in the more northern and remote areas where there's just a complete scarcity of supports available, particularly for those without internet service, et cetera. So, but, many women talked about having to Google to find, and it was a lonely experience for them. And of course, they also talked about the sudden, as you called it, Kenny, the cliff when they turn 18, and the kind of the lack of supports for their adult children once they're out of the public system. So the third, and certainly not the least important, but it's the racist and misogynist assumptions that are made about Indigenous women. this was a predominant theme. And I'll give you examples, like when requesting a diagnosis, many Indigenous women were denied and told that their condition was, or their child's condition was more likely due to fetal alcohol syndrome, which plays on that age-old trope. Others also reported that they were told their condition was due to intergenerational trauma and not autism. And all that to say, although certainly Indigenous women are dealing with the after effects of intergenerational trauma, that should not be preventing them from receiving an assessment for autism. When discussing the kind of the system, so the public school system, the healthcare provision and policing, the racism and misogyny that these Indigenous women faced regularly, it was quite something. Interactions with police, for example, were particularly difficult. One woman said that her young son with autism tended to leave the home by himself and basically go missing for a time. And when she would call the police for help in finding him, she was not treated with respect, to put it mildly. She felt that her son was going to be harmed once found by the police because they didn't really have an understanding of autism. And she also worried that he would be taken away from her if found that she was being judged and perhaps being a negligent parent. So again, the complete racist and misogynist attitudes. Another point that came out frequently was the general lack of understanding of autism in healthcare and school system. The physical environment for class activities, for example, is not appropriate for those with autism, and they're frequently excluded from kind of social activities with their classmates, which when it worsens their isolation. One woman suggested that there ought to be, like every school board should have an Indigenous lead who can and develop or create a support team for parents and caregivers of kids in school with autism. One grandmother noted that she was constantly being called by the school. She would take her grandson to school and get called within an hour or two to come and pick him up because they just didn't know how to deal with an episode or with him. So it was quite unfortunate. I'll leave it there for now. Hold the next question.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
That's great. So now we're going to throw it down to Charles. Let's hear Charles' perspective on that same question.
Okay, thank you. I have a different angle looking at this about autism. First of all, before I continue, I forgot to mention that I sit on the non-education committee as well for Windigo Tribal Council. I think that's why they asked me to participate today. And also I want to acknowledge the Algonquins and Anishinaabe traditional territory. I want to acknowledge for hosting this event in their traditional territory. But anyway, going back to the question, as I said, I'm from the remote community of Berskin. I was born and raised there. Even though I had to leave my community later on to go pursue my high school education and also post-secondary university education. I had no choices back. Even today, our young people are struggling with that. But when you talk about autism, that's something that we never really heard of. It's kind of recent in our area, especially in our remote communities. We're still trying to define what autism is, what it means and what it does. We've talked to a lot of people, even our elders say, we have to be careful how we define people with those conditions, those individuals that have autism. To there's people that have been asking me, how do you translate autism in one word in the language? I said, you cannot at this point translate in one language because it's very complex. You almost have to define it by looking at an individual with autism through their behavior and the conditions of that person, whether it may be child or an adult. So this is where it's very difficult to come up with services and programs, how we can tackle that, because we just don't have anything available right now. And that's what when I said from the beginning, when I talked about trying to come up with services, even our specialized programs are very limited. Our specialized programs are geared for other conditions as well, like ADHD, FAS, FASD, and all those other conditions that our young people are facing today. So we have to focus on autism because the numbers are increasing. And the other critical factor is our students, our children are not diagnosed early, no early detection. We always have to wait for 3-4 years before they see a specialist to get assessed, examined, in order for to get whatever condition they may be. And I know we have children that are not properly assessed right now in our schools. And I know our teachers, our principals are dealing with this, trying to deal with it, how they can help our children with autistic conditions. Because we have set programs for them and we're not equipped to do that at this very moment. So in order for us to tackle this issue, we have to go after the government, ask the government to help us with financial resources. And also looking around in this room, we have organizations here that work with autistic situations, circumstances. And we need these research groups to come to our areas and do some research in our communities, because we don't have that research, and that research will help us and advocate for us to get those resources into our communities. And we don't have that today. So I'm asking you, my new partners in the room today, this is where we need help in our area, because we can't do it alone, but we have to take on new allies to work with us. And in order for us to do that, we must continue to do that work, because even though we're doing it in our individual communities, but a lot of times when you're in a remote location, you don't have those opportunities. Because when you live in if your community is close to a city, you can drive 2-3 hours and the services are right there. But in our remote locations, we don't have those opportunities, those luxuries. And that's why I want to put pressure on there was a politician here yesterday that talked about passing that legislation, national strategy. These things should be dealt with in that national strategy, because our Indigenous people always get left behind. And we have to be on the forefront what everybody does. And that's what I mean by we need allies. And you are the allies in this room. That's the way I look at it. So in order for us to improve those services, we need help, and that help right now. That's what I'm saying. So I just wanted to be clear where I'm coming from with our problems and our challenges when we talk about national strategy. It's one fit for all. That's the way I look at it. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about it for now. I have other things I want to talk about after. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Charles. That was really great. I have time for Bertha as well.
Okay, thank you. What are the current needs and gaps requiring immediate attention for improving autism and neurodiversity support in Indigenous communities? And as my counterpart mentioned, early diagnosis is one. And also, once you get diagnosis, then you kind of need to find the pathway to supports, once you, have that, that diagnosis like that, then what's next, so we kind of need the pathways to the required access to services, and assessments and supports as well, like the professional supports, like with, the professional counselors, doctors, and basically that health field aspect of it when it comes from, like, once you find out about diagnosis, and also in the schools, like education assistants, autism support teachers. And one thing I heard was autism support teachers in our schools. Like right now, it's not sufficiently staffed in most of our northern communities. They're all isolated communities. Out of 49 First Nation communities in NAN, 33 are fly-in or winter road accessible. So when you're trying to get your child assessed, you basically got to drag them out of your home community and go into an urban environment. So really, we need the professionals to come into our communities to, have a regular check-in with and doing assessments within the schools, because normally it's the schools that identify it first rather than the parent. That actually happened with me. So and again, basically you need to, like what was mentioned yesterday, we need to have that data and research, like that was noted this morning, what gets measured gets funded. And really it's funding that's also an issue with trying to help our children go through the education system, receive the proper supports and social services and in building a good life for themselves. And one thing I was looking at was maybe have a navigator in each community so that they create a pathway to access services and travel and navigation and coordination of services within the remote communities. Because when you look at what's there now, there's nothing. There's no infrastructure. The schools are small, they're old, they're moldy, probably been in the news several times, but still nothing's changed. It's still there. And it seems like we're overlooked as a community when it comes to this national autism strategy. It's where are we in that? Where are we in trying to, when the federal government is trying to develop this strategy? We weren't even invited to the table, and once we were, we're like an afterthought. We only have like 2 weeks to get something to them, and really there's got to be more comprehensive, a more thorough engagement with us, because we are, impacted the most, I think, especially when you live on the two-thirds of this province and we're so spread out, and accessibility is an issue, travel, even food security. You know how much food costs up there, and they charge us the freight for each item that you purchase at the store. Like that's, and Northern Stores has a monopoly up there, so bringing some competition, because competition lowers prices. And there's just so many areas. It's not just autism, it's also, it's housing, it's food security, it's transportation, and really when you look at this, we really should be looking at the knowledge keepers and elders in the community. They're the ones that know our children. I know one term that came to mind in trying to describe autism was that a child who thinks differently. So there is no Cree or Ojibwe or Ojibwe word for the term autism. That's not a term we would say in our languages. Just that it's a child who thinks differently. Trying to look at my notes. I think that's it.
Okay. Thank you so much. That's awesome. Thanks, Bertha. Yes, a child who thinks differently and a population that needs a different strategy. I think I'm hearing some good themes here. Okay, let's move on to question 2. I want to get all these in. What are actionable items that the federal government needs to prioritize to address these gaps through a national strategy? And Grant, I think you're first.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. So when I thought about this, I was just really thinking about all the conversations I've had right across Canada and even internationally. I've had hundreds, if not thousands, of meetings with parents, educators, service providers, people working in community and urban settings, even from remote settings. And what I kind of came to the conclusion is that all of these different perspectives, they have to be built into whatever strategy that we decide to bring forward, right? So I don't know what's happening in the background with all of this, but one thing that I would highly encourage is the development and implementation of a distinction-based decision-making body. And so what I mean by that is when you look at Indigenous peoples right across Canada, we're very diverse, right? You have treaty people, you have unceded, you have Métis, you have Inuit, you have First Nations, you have remote, you have urban, you have rural, and each of these groups gets very nuanced very quickly. You have on reserve, you have off reserve. And so when I think about a distinction-based approach, what I'm always looking for is progress and not perfection. There's no way you would ever get to perfection, even in a non-Indigenous context right across Canada. And that's fair. I'm not looking for that. What I am looking for is an opportunity for all the different perspectives to be able to provide input into the strategy. And so when I think about a distinction base, it would have to at least be broken up into 3 parts. So Inuit, Métis, and then First Nations. And then you work from there. And so because I'm a Cree person, I don't speak on behalf of the Métis or Inuit. I don't even speak on behalf of my own community. I'm one parent to 2 autistic children. And so take whatever I'm saying from that perspective, because I don't know everything and I don't pretend to. But when I think about this decision-making body, first and foremost, it has to be Indigenous led. So don't get me wrong, we can partner, we can collaborate, we can work together. But if the final decision doesn't come back to Indigenous peoples about what's going to happen with it, the results are going to show that. And on top of that, I would even encourage having people with lived experience of people who work with or have family members or autistic themselves. Because if you don't get those perspectives built in, the results are going to show. Now, I'm doing this kind of approach at a very micro level within my community. So I developed the Maskwacis Autism Advisory Circle. We meet monthly, we talk research, we talk events, we talk how to make our community more inclusive. And we look for solutions, right? We don't get bogged down by all the problems. We know they're there, we honor them, we acknowledge them, but we're really mindful of keeping ourselves really strength-based. And I know other people have talked about we don't have a specific word for autism, and that's true. But I've talked with quite a few elders on this, language speakers in my community, and we speak Plains Cree. And the one word that actually keeps coming up is Emikoset Pitos AC Waskawit, which translates as somebody who is different. Not even thinking, but even their being. Autistic people in my community are known as spiritual gifts. And that to me is such a powerful way of going about this. So when I think about a national autism strategy, it has to layer the culture. We have to honor, our language within it. We have to be able to lead it in really healthy ways. It has to be really relational. So I don't usually use, pan-Indigenous terminology, but I would argue that all Indigenous peoples are relational. We're very relational. We prioritize relationships over everything else. And this is where some of the problems come in, because if you look at the way services and supports are built, it's very transactional. It's like you get your hour and then somebody gets paid, and that's the end of it sometimes. Whereas me and my family, we have to go and find people, occupational therapists, speech language. And the first thing we ask them is like, what kind of relationship do you want to have with us? Is this purely you getting paid and providing some sort of service? Or are you going to come into our family and be, almost like kin to us? And so thinking about whatever strategy you build, relationships have to be priority. And then looking for opportunities to give back. This is another big one. A strategy like this, when it comes into our communities, can be very extractive. It's taking what you need, your data, your information, and then applying it at some level. And somebody's probably going to get paid for all of that. They're going to get paid for the research, the data analysis. And most of these people who are getting paid for it are going to be non-Indigenous. And so people are going to benefit from this strategy, and making sure that we're mutually benefiting communities, families, and the people who you're actually getting the information from as well. And you can do this in multiple ways, right? You can use an iterative process. So looking at, taking new information in, learning from that, and then maybe you see a problem that you can deal with right away. So some low-hanging fruit that's, you can deal with. For example, in my community, unfortunately, we have some, as most communities do, we're rural, about an hour south of Edmonton. We have some really bad Wi-Fi and cell phone service. And I started asking questions on why this is, because Wetaskiwin, which is the town over here, and Ponoka, which is the town over here, have great cell phone service. But Musquecheese, which is in the middle of them, you lose it all. And what I learned is that there's 2 cell phone towers built going each way. And what this does is it makes getting a diagnosis harder, getting supports and services harder, getting any type of communication out there to, outside of the reserve, much more difficult. And that to me is systemic discrimination, but it's something we can deal with. It's low-hanging fruit. We could fix that problem tomorrow if we wanted, if we had enough political will. But we have to start addressing these problems right away, looking for solutions, and then everybody benefits, not just Indigenous people. If this strategy is able to take a really healthy Indigenous-led approach, all Canadians benefit. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Grant. Can you see all the hands waving? That's great. Okay, same question. I'm going to throw it to Kenny Robertson. Please.
Yes, thanks for the question, and thanks to the other panelists for your answers. So for me, when it comes to First Nations communities, there are significant gaps in autism supports must be addressed. To address these gaps, the federal government must prioritize the national autism strategy with First Nations communities. The strategy must focus on actionable items that can make real difference in the lives of First Nation individuals with autism and their families. The first actionable item is the increased funding of autism research focusing on First Nations communities, better understanding these communities' unique needs and challenges. If I'm speaking too fast, please tell me to slow down. So by better understanding these communities' unique needs and challenges, we can design cultural responsive services and supports that meet their needs. The second item is to develop cultural responsive diagnosis and assessment tools. These tools must be recognized the diverse cultural and linguistic background of First Nations individuals and families, enabling them to access the supports they need. Third, we must increase access to autism services and supports in First Nations communities. This includes early intervention services, behavioral therapy, speech therapy, and occupational therapy, but more importantly, screening. For me, I sat on this panel about 5 years ago at the invitation of Margaret Whalen, thanks again, of talking about logistics, talking about that, flying communities are astronomical cost for logistics to fly in and out of, and that the actual logistics cost more than the assessment itself. And this is where the systematic barriers begin, because they are denied or delayed these. To move on to my fourth actionable item is to specialize training and support for educators and healthcare professionals working with First Nations individuals with autism must be provided. This will enable them to provide the best possible care and support to those who need it. Fifth, we must increase public awareness and understanding of autism with First Nations communities through culturally relevant and accessible resources. These resources include workshops, webinars, and educational materials, enabling First Nations communities to understand autism better and to access service and supports they need. These are just a few actionable items the federal government need to prioritize to address the gaps in autism services for First Nations communities. We need to ensure that the needs and perspectives of First Nation individuals with autism and their families are represented in national policy decisions related to autism services and supports. Furthermore, we need to build partnerships, but also Indigenous-led with First Nations communities to co-design and implement autism programs that are culturally responsive and to meet the unique needs of their communities and these communities. Addressing systematic barriers to access autism services and supports for First Nations communities, including lack of transportation, insufficient funding, and inadequate infrastructure is also vital. Finally, we must ensure that First Nations individuals with autism are on the spectrum and their families have access to culturally responsive and accessible mental health services to support the overall well-being. In conclusion, addressing gaps in autism support for First Nation communities is a critical issue that requires urgent action. We must work together to create a national autism strategy that prioritizes these actionable items and enables First Nation individuals with autism and their families to access the support they need to thrive and be successful. Some of the things, those are kind of it in a nutshell for myself. But to be honest, when I sat here, 5 years ago at the convention center, I talked about these things already. And it's very frustrating for me, even though I don't show it, that I'm still talking about these things. And it's very undermining to those that have older relationship that's even older than Canada. We're talking about before it was even a thought. What does that relationship mean? Well, all relationships are built on trust. If we learn anything from history about residential schools, and we're still finding those children today, well, how do you rebuild that? Not just reconcile, but rebuild that trust. Well, it's not to impose or dictate policy to us. And this is what has been the undermining since the Indian Act. How many of you heard of informed consent? Raise your hand. Okay, how many have heard to consult? Okay, so under the Constitution, you as Canadians have a duty to be having informed consent, but also a duty to consult. This is enshrined in your laws, but more importantly, that it's about that trust with First Nations communities. Well, where is this relationship currently? Well, I'll let you know about the Indian Act because it's one of the more important vital pieces of information that I try and tell people of how they kind of look at us in regards to identifying developmental disabled in the Indian Act. Section 51 of the Indian Act addresses the property of mentally incompetent Indians. Mentally incompetent Indians. We're talking about a legislation that's over 150 years old, and it's still here in the 21st century. What does that say about Canadian society and law? Are they acceptable or tolerable of us? Or are they willfully blind not to address it? More recently, I'll update you, the current government that's in hand has taken this pressure or challenge to change the wording of the Indian Act, where I'm saying that the Indian Act is an enslavement law that should be abolished. That's just my radical side about it. You can hold it against me if you want, but at the same time, this is what we are dealing with concurrently, our status quo. And if we're talking about self-determination, how can we talk about self-determination if we're living in under these laws? So thank you. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, Kenny. That was wonderful. Okay, and that leads us into our next question. So here in the room, we have a various group of people from different backgrounds and different supports, advocates, policymakers, politicians, community members, autistic peoples of all kinds. What can they and other members of the community do right now to be allies and support Indigenous communities? And I think I'm going to Bertha first. Eek. Eek.
Okay, well, yesterday I was sitting at a table and I really learned from them, and one of them had shared about participating in an event, and really it's about educating yourself too on the TRC, all the calls to action, basically education on the history of Indigenous people in this country, murdered, missing, final report. You know, all these things are impacting our community. Still to this day, it's intergenerational. So that's one thing you can do, and you know, be our allies in this. You know, if we're not at the table at this National Action Strategy, to ask where is the Indigenous, you know, representatives at this table. Include us in anything that's, you know, impacts us. And I kind of want to use that term that I've heard the last few days about without us, that, you know, it kind of applies to us as well, not just autism itself, but also Indigenous peoples in this country. Yeah, because I was really quite surprised how little people know about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that spanned over 5 years. I was actually in a Writers Fest here in this city, and we had one of the authors there was the one that wrote about the 7 youth inquests in Thunder Bay, and one elderly person stood up and says, "This is the first I'm hearing about this, that this happens in this country." And I'm like, where were you for the last 5 years? I didn't say that, but because I'm trying to be kind to people, but really educating her. It was an education there. So I'm glad that there's more books that like that kind of speak to the injustices we've you know, experienced, kind of stem from residential school. And really it's intergenerational, you know, when you think about all the trauma that's been inflicted on our children or our parents who were children, or grandparents who were children. So yeah, and I like the fact that, you know, that, well, I kind of overlooked it myself about including culture in anything that we want to implement in terms of the Autism National Action or Autism Strategy. Like, we kind of need to, like, what's a good practice for you guys for non-Indigenous might not fit for us in Indigenous communities. You know, when it comes to like the land heals us, you know, like, and if you're autism and you have the sensory issues, you go out in the land, you go out in the woods, man, they're just probably just loving it because it's so calm and quiet, and, you know, and for us as a people, we go out in the land, we, you know, harvest food, we hunt, we fish, and, you know, just do the activities that comes along, like, you know, tanning hides, make crafts, that kind of stuff. And it's hard work, but we do it because it's our culture. It's who we are. So what can you do right now to be allies and support us? Yeah, that include us in, you know, your best practices, and we can use that information to kind of adopt it into our communities, because my community is not the same as the northwestern side there with Bearskin Lake with Charles. So the language is different. The spirituality is different. Not all are traditional. I know there's a high presence of I can't remember the religion, but I know there's like Mennonites there and Christianity, and that's a strong thing. But there's a lot going back to our traditions, as well as living on land, doing sweat lodges and ceremonies and powwows, and, you know, just reclaiming our culture and our ceremonies, which is, you know, really it's healing as well, and passing that on to our children. And, you know, like they have a sense of belonging when we share that those practices. We bring those practices because, you know, in our current education system, it hasn't been good for our you know, self-esteem. When you look at there's really, in the history books, there's really nothing that's current right now. It's all old stuff, when saying that, oh, we weren't good citizens, or we were, you know, what's that term? Warriors. We're like cowboys and Indians. They were like the bad people, kind of thing.
We were the savages, remember? There's a book called that.
Noble savages.
There you go. Yeah, that's a better term. I think we are noble and we're savage when it comes to, you know, protecting our children.
Mhm.
So yeah, like you know, land-based, it's growing in our communities. A lot of activities are happening on the land. It's part of you know, teaching our children how to survive on the land. It's harvesting on the land. But it's also, you know, really good for as a healing practice for our kids, and especially their autism, like they're safer out there, and we don't have to worry about somebody coming and stealing them, because that does also happen with, especially with drive-in communities, northern communities.
Mhm.
We lose our children that way. And yeah, basically, yeah, include us and recognize that we're here. See us and be good.
Thank you. Jennifer, same question.
Yeah. So back to what we heard in our sharing circles, and much of it will reflect what you've spoken about, Bertha. But there was an overwhelming emphasis during the discussions in the circles about the significance of Indigenous cultural values and traditions in terms of conceptualizing and thinking about and understanding lives of people with autism. So it was a very holistic approach to wellness that was raised, and that means, spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally. And one mother, actually, when you speak about the importance of being on the land and close to Mother Earth, a mother would take her son out of school. I think it was in Toronto, where they lived. And then when school was out in June, she took him back to her home with her relatives in, I think it was New Brunswick, a rural area of New Brunswick. And he was a different child. He was much calmer, less stressed. And he, in fact, he was young, and he told her, those teachers in school, they don't know what they're talking about. Like he was comfortable in his world in a rural setting. So the question of what others can do, I would say I'd start by setting aside the dominant colonial paradigm around disabilities in general. Again, many women in our sharing circles talked about their children as people who simply think differently. And neurodiversity is not considered a disability. And it's that opposition against disability and able people, and the ableism. So, if we can imagine just for a minute, even what we could do if we did away with that paradigm and thought of how we as humans are supposed to think and learn and interact under that paradigm, and anything outside of that is a disability. I think we have to kind of park that. And how do groups ally meaningfully with Indigenous people, meet up and listen. And listen is the key word here, to those with knowledge and actual lived experience with autism. And for policy making, whether it's in the public sphere or usually is, but I mean, just approaches from NGOs, et cetera. It's not about developing a policy first and then assuming everyone's going to just fit into it. It's listen first and incorporate views and perspectives that actually are going to be beneficial to the people that it ought to be helping. So that's how you develop policy. You actually listen, and it's not just at the kind of consultation stage. Indigenous women need to be at the table too throughout the process. So not just developing the policy and determining what it contains, it's about implementing. As we've heard today, every community is going to have different needs. And there has to be good listening skills and incorporation. Inclusion is what it's about, to me.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. All right, I'm going to move it to Charles to answer as well.
Okay, good afternoon. This question, I was reflecting on it for the past couple of days, even before I arrived in Ottawa, when I was coming here. And when we talk about, I was going to actually touch base on the Indian Act as well, because my colleague here, when he talked about it, it's almost like all First Nations right across Canada, where we are dictated by the things that we do by this bill, the suppressing, the Indian Act that he talked about. It continues to happen, even though it's over 100 years now. That's been in existence. But also, you have to remember some of our nations, and especially in the Nan territory, we are the signatories of Treaty Number 9. And I believe my communities north of Sioux we are the adhesion Treaty Number 9, which was signed back in July 5, 1929. And our grandfathers and our great grandfathers were the signatories with the two governments. It was a tripartite signing, a treaty signing back then. Were involved. Even Ontario was involved, and of course Canada was the major player in all of this. So even though at that time Canada and these governments, they made promises that they would look after us, and the two primary components of those promises were to look after our education and health. And and we heard from other panelists here that today we're still anticipating those promises. It's not like they have reached their potential promises that that they would that would benefit our people, and not just the present generation, also for the future generations. So this is why I feel that in order to understand Indian Act, you will know how suppressing it is for our First Nations people. And it's really, you cannot really move forward when you get suppressed by by Indian Act, and you cannot really move forward, because we're so limited, and also all the money that we apply for is very limited. It's a policy-driven process. It's not legislated. When you're legislated, there's a guarantee that the money is going to flow. But when you're policy-driven, the money is only limited. You might not get it the following year if you apply for it again. That's how the system works. So we need to get away from that in order for us to improve our services dealing with conditions like autism. We need a constant flow of funding sources, resources, so we can help our autistic individuals in our communities. And when you look at when you deal with autistic individuals in our communities, often we talk about overcrowded housing. And I hear government, I've read reports, not from Google, but from reports from different researchers. They talk about our people as dysfunctional families. That's what they use when they describe us. And where does that dysfunctional system come from? A lot of it was our family values were disrupted by the residential school system, and even the day school system in our communities. A lot of it was interrupted by that, because they wanted to bring their system into our communities to make us to be a Canadian, a true Canadian citizen. But our people understood we need to go back and use our cultural perspective and concepts when we deal with stuff like that. Right now, we're also dealing with the loss of our languages. We are losing our languages. We are not practicing as much as our culture. We're not practicing that. And what does that tell you? So that's why I agree with some of the panels where they mentioned we have to start doing things from our own who we are as First Nations people. It has to be First Nations led. and all of the stuff that we're doing. And I'm hoping this part of this national strategy will allow us to do that, and also to work with you people. Like, you are our allies here. You are supposed to help us and support us. You are our advocates in many respects. So I want you. This is why I wanted to bring that up, especially with that particular question that is being asked today. And what I find, even in our area in Solacau, is we need a central hub service provider. Our communities are remote. I think there's only 3 communities that are driving from Solacau district communities. And still, they're still lacking services in those communities that I'm talking about. You know, they're still dealing with the same issues that they were dealing with before the road was built into their community. So in order for us to go get our students or our children or anybody else assessed, we have to send them to Thunder Bay, Winnipeg, sometimes Toronto. And that's like 2 to 3 years later by the time you made a referral. So we don't have, like I said, we don't have those opportunities. We don't have those luxuries. We have to wait. It's almost too late to try and assess and diagnose children by the time they're in grade 3, grade 4, because early detection will allow us to plan ahead. If we don't have those opportunities now, as like we're lacking those opportunities, we'll never get ahead. Look what happened here just recently with this pandemic. We were already struggling. Now we're going through probably additional 2 years, we're falling behind on top of that. We had to deal with the connectivity issue. You know, we're using Anderson speech for speech pathology. We're using Tiny Eye from Saskatchewan. And when they try to do one-on-one with our students, speech pathology or whatever assessment they were doing, some of the students refused to do that because they would rather be sitting face to face with that individual, that professional specialist. They don't want to talk about themselves on, you know, using Zoom or whatever. So this is how difficult it is. So we need people on the ground too to do this, not just to come there for one day and fly out in the evening. They need to be there at least 2 weeks to do the work. If you want to do the work properly, that has to be done in this way. They have to stay in our communities for an extended period of time. It can't be just overnight 2-day trips, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done when you do assessments. And I've seen it myself, coming from a teaching background. I've seen how these assessments are conducted by these professionals. So what I'm saying is, everything now that we're way behind for a lot of things in our communities, we need to speed up, and we need to get those resources now to get this work underway. So I want you to understand that everything is expensive up north. Wasaya, our main carrier, just up their airfare just about a week ago. And that's going to cost a lot of money, you know, to bring these people into the community or bring our kids out for medical services and supports. That's the greatest challenge we're facing today. And that's why I wanted to answer it this way, because I want you to know that we are struggling, and don't forget about us. Work with us. You know, we're gonna work with you with open arms, but allow us even to lead some of these initiatives when we're dealing with this autism in our communities. So I want to thank you for listening. Mikoj.
Thank you, Charles. Grant, same question. What can we do now?
So Over the past year, I've had the amazing opportunity to teach medical students exactly about this. A lot of them are excited, they're open-minded, they want to do the work that needs to get done in communities. And I often tell them and I encourage them to really start to unpack some of the beliefs they have about Indigenous people. Now there's a room there full of people who all have a lot of experience with autism and other types of disabilities. And so the example I love using is myself. And so when my sons were first diagnosed, I didn't know anything about autism. I was this person who just like, I was really excited to learn about it and start to, think about it in different ways. But I feel like I had ableist beliefs. And those ableist beliefs were actually stopping me from doing the work I needed to get done because there's an apprehension in me. But the more I unpacked them, the more I learned about it, the more I started to really reflect on some of the beliefs that I held, the more engaged I got with my own children, with the broader community around disabilities. And so unfortunately, the thing that has happened within Canada is there's a lot of racist beliefs. There's a lot of information withheld from Canadians. The example I'll use is, when did you first learn about residential schools? Were you an adult? And why do you think that was? Why do you think the government withheld that information from you? I'm just going to sit there for a second and let you think on it. Because then you're left to make up things on your own to fill those gaps on your own. And unfortunately, this leads to discrimination, it leads to negative beliefs. And so I went through this entire process with ableism. So I'm encouraging other people to unpack their own beliefs around Indigenous peoples. Canada has a very dark history when it comes to Indigenous peoples, right? We talked about the Indian Act, residential schools, Indian hospitals, 60 scoop, missing and murdered Indigenous women. But it's even happening today. So Canada in 2016 was found guilty of human rights abuses against Indigenous children, against First Nations children living on reserve. And they still haven't fully accepted that. They're still fighting against it, even though all of the evidence knows it's there. And this is still happening today. The discrimination is still happening today. Human rights abuses in Canada against First Nations children is still happening today. But then the question becomes, is how do we start to grapple with these truths, right? And I often encourage people, let's start to really lean into some of this discomfort. These conversations, they do make people uncomfortable, but that feeling of discomfort isn't there to make you feel bad or guilty. It's there to teach you. I've learned that in ceremony that, and through ceremony, we have to go through a process of a lot of discomfort. And that discomfort is trying to teach you something. So I highly encourage at a very personal level to learn how to lean into that discomfort. And that's where you start to get really healthy connections, relationships, and all these other different things. But even I guess at a more practical level, learning how to listen. I know people talk about listening probably this entire conference, this entire summit. And the example I like using is, when you're having a conversation with somebody and they're talking, but you're already formulating a response in your head, that means you're not listening, you're not being present, you're not being mindful. And when I'm in community and I go to ceremonies and I see elders and they're interacting with each other, there's a 1 to 2 minute pause between the other person talking. And I have to ask, why did they do that? And it's because they said, I'm listening to them. And then I'm formulating a response. And then I'm thinking critically about how to make sure that my response isn't coming from a place of like emotion or anything. I'm really just trying to unpack what I'm trying to say to you before I say it. And unfortunately, we live in a hyper communicative world where you need a response and silence is awkward. And then, so learning, another important thing I think is learning about the TRC, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but also the 94 calls to action. So if you're working at an organizational level, how are you implementing those 94 calls to action in your organization? There's 94 of them. I'm sure some of them will fit. And then finally, I'm going to just do this because I'm coming out with a documentary and the premieres tomorrow, 1 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. And it's looking exactly at this. It's following me and my son. We have a pediatrician, we have an elder, we have a community perspective, and it unpacks exactly what's happening in our communities and what we can start to do about it. you know, because we do need support. We have to take the lead on this, but we need as much support as we can get. So again, I want to thank you all for listening and allowing me to share today. Hi.
Great. Thank you, Grant. All right, last person to go, Kenny.
Oh, geez. Hard act to follow, I'll
Right.
tell you. So allies out there, if you are allies, because, you know, we are very hesitant when calling each other allies, because meaning it's a built respect of trust, right? So do I trust you to do what I say? Probably not. I'll trust myself to do what I say, that's for sure. But saying that, I'm going to kind of bottleneck it down to how many of you heard of cultural competency? Can you raise your hand? How many have taken cultural competency? Raise your hand. Okay. Do you know if it's accredited cultural competency that you've taken? Yes, see, this is the thing that I've engaged with in regards to officials, policymakers, legislators, and some of the things that I talk about, obviously, people are hesitant to answer because it is a hard question, but that's what I'm here for. I'm here to ask those hard questions because I want to hear a hard, truthful answer. And what it becomes is prevalent to me that you are being sincere, because that's what relationships are about too, is being sincere to each other. And we're talking about a relationship between Indigenous people in Canada. But not only that, an older relationship that's beyond Canada. And some of the allies that I see in here before have asked me this question before when I was here 5 years ago. So again, you know, not to be frustrated, and I'm not showing it very well, but I've told actually Mr. Munson here about having boots on the ground. In any campaign, not saying it's a war, but in any campaign, you have to have boots on the ground. You have to have cultural competency when engaging with the community at large. Because it's not stakeholders. We are not stakeholders. We're the originals. So that we are not considered stakeholders. We're actually something else. But saying that, as allies, we can do better. We are doing better by just sitting here and listening, but also having real conversations in real time. And that's what it sort of Grant Bruno was talking about, is living in the now, being present, so that we aren't just formulating a conversation and having a meaningful conversation, but actually having a real response to the conversation at hand instead of thinking of how it relates to me. Well, I'm going to tell you, as allies, it's been a real dark and grim history, as Grant's pointed out. But I don't like looking too far back. I look forward, but learning from the mistakes from the past. And how do we grow, not just as a community, but of more of an inclusive community with those who have the oldest relationships here today? Furthermore, though, I think that as allies, you and I need to really lay down the foundation of that relationship and not just reconcile, but really make a meaningful impact to those. And what you can do now today is look up residential schools and the Black history of, or dark history of what it represents and why it's so prevalent today, with children being dug up or children being, which is low radar findings around residential schools. Then you get to understand why we're so hesitant with old residential school comparison to the child welfare system, which is just a different name for me. And that's why for me, there's about 50% of those are Indigenous children, which only represent 5% of the population. But one thing that stands out as allies I want to talk about with you is about justice. I'm not talking about social justice here. I'm talking about the rotating door of justices of IDDs that are going through prison systems that are not getting rehabilitated, or the actual supports that they need to thrive or be in a society that should be inclusive. Because we live in a dark world that is not inclusive, that we try to paint a picture that it is, but the dark reality is that it is not. And we have to do a better job when it comes to identifying these key indicators of that we cannot do this any longer with the justice system. But a lot of things too I advocated for before is regarding talking about seniors. Why aren't there any guaranteed long-term beds for those who are going to become seniors who are on the spectrum? Well, some evidence that I've found is that because the life expectancies are lower, they won't even see the retirement. And that's why it's not so prevalent. So it's up to us to start making this a safe space, not just for ourselves, but for them to thrive in, especially in the justice system, because there's, I'll tell you right now, a lot of, say, in the female sector of those who are incarcerated are Indigenous women. And this is one of the things that really irks me. As you see, I wear a pin to support missing and murdered Indigenous women because they are the cradle of life. They are the life givers. Men like to take the credit, but women are the ones who are always there for us, who always take care of us, who make sure we have something in our bellies at night, who make sure we have shelter. But the reality for Indigenous people is that we don't have enough housing, we don't have enough clean drinking water, we have food insecurities, we have a lack of education supports that where children have to travel over 100 kilometers a day just to get a proper education. Well, what is that education teaching them? Is there actual Indigenous studies there? No, you actually have to go to higher learning. You have to go to college or university to learn about Indigenous history. That is not being conducted by an Indigenous person, by the way. So it becomes really apparent to me that as allies, what you can do here now is start learning about Canadian history, the true history. Because at the end of the day, if they're not putting it in books, who is the onus on them to better understand each other, that cultural humility, to better understand that, you know what, you are a human being just as I am to you. But under the Indian Act, I am not considered a human being. I'm actually considered a ward estate, meaning I am a person who is inept to make these decisions for myself, and that I am a foster kid to the father of Canada, which is the Prime Minister or the minister at hand, whoever sits on the throne in that time period. But what we have to do as a country is learn from these mistakes so that we can look forward to a better future for our children, because we won't be here. We are not immortal people. We are here for the children of tomorrow to betterment so that we can have a more inclusive society. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I thank you for not just listening, but thank you for being here. It makes a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenny. And I'll say Walalan, which is what we say in Mi'kmaq, to say thank you. We're at time. Thank you so much for listening and for all the panelists. Really, really, really some compelling information. I hope you're all taking notes. I took a lot of notes, but I don't have a lot of time to summarize other than to say, include us, listen to us, see us, and allow Indigenous-led work be done for this strategy. And thank you for the opportunity, Maddie Deaver. I'll show a shout out for you.